Good morning and welcome to the War Department, because the era of the Department of Defense is over. From this moment forward, the only mission of the newly restored Department of War is this: warfighting, preparing for war and preparing to win, unrelenting and uncompromising in that pursuit. And as history teaches us, the only people who actually deserve peace are those who are willing to wage war to defend it. That's why pacifism is so naive and dangerous. It ignores human nature and it ignores human history. Either you protect your people and your sovereignty, or you will be subservient to something or someone. And since waging war is so costly in blood and treasure, we owe our republic a military that will win any war we choose, or any war that is thrust upon us. Should our enemies choose foolishly to challenge us, they will be crushed by the violence, precision, and ferocity of the War Department. In other words, to our enemies, F-A-F-O.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. My name is Andy Lipson, and I'm joined by Michael Hoffman and Kenny Zepeda. Eduardo is not here today. He's not feeling well and will be back next week. We are online at what'sleftpodcast.com. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, share your favorite episode, and jot down our information wherever you found this episode. And as always, if you want any shirts, you can contact us through what'sleftpodcast.com and get a What's Left shirt. All right. So today it's just us gentlemen, the socialists of the crew. And Kenny, this may be your last episode for a while, correct?
Yeah, I think so. I'm gonna be busy again with work and stuff.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. And in the spirit of that, I told Kenny that he should pick our subject today. So Kenny, what are we talking about?
So we've on the show been looking at a lot of, I guess, internal or we've had an internal view of things like spirituality, the Charlie Kirk events, right? And I feel that we haven't taken a look at what's going on in the world. What is the U.S. doing? What do some of the events that have happened, recently, like strikes in Qatar, things happening in Southeast Asia. There's things happening in Israel, Ukraine, and more than anything, I'm interested in trying to get a sense of what the strategy is, what is happening, and why, and maybe tackle some of the questions that come up, because the most dominant arguments that I hear is that the U.S. doesn't have a strategy, or that it has bad leadership, right? And so I don't see it that way, and I'm just curious, to explore as to how we see these kind of global events in terms of the American strategy, and if is there a successful implementation of a strategy, or is the U.S. in trouble? Those are kind of like the main questions that I have in my mind.
Right. And before we get into it, Michael, speaking of where are we, you're not showing your screen today. So where are you? Yeah. Tell us a little about where you are.
I am obeying all safety laws in my car.
Okay.
Between soccer games.
So Michael won't be showing his screen because he's trying to travel safely while he's joining us for this episode.
I will say that I agreed with Kenny's proposal to talk about things like in the international situation, and there's many different events I have not been following closely. So what I have more than anything is a lot of questions.
Yeah.
But I do think that things we've discussed before, things we know from history, do help us understand it in the broad sense. But there's a lot of stuff happening that I don't fully understand.
Yeah. So let's spell out some of those a little bit just to get the array of things going on. And I'll say some of the ones that I know about. And Kenny, maybe you can add, and Michael, you can add. So obviously we've got the war in Ukraine. We've got Europe talking more militantly about entering into that war, talking more like we are at war with Russia, being more explicit about that. You've got the recent in that region. You've got the recent Russian, so-called Russian drones into Estonia and Poland and blah blah blah, like MiGs flying over things into NATO territories and being taken on by them. Poland talking about we are at war with Russia as well. You have the U.S. saying it wants out of the war, but then saying like, okay, we're just going to fund the war. We're going to fund, Europe's going to pay for weapons, even as much as Tomahawks, and they may or may not get sent, but we all know that the U.S. will have to basically be sending those Tomahawks into Russia if they do get sent. You have the U.S. talking about invading, well, basically blowing up boats in international waters here in our hemisphere. And in the backdrop, there's a national defense strategy that's being talked about that, like, the U.S. is not going to be emphasizing taking on China as much, but maybe like really recontrolling its own hemisphere. But that's just back there. While it looks like it's pushing for a war with Venezuela, and at least a regime change with Venezuela. You have the reintroduction of military stuff in the neighborhood of Iran, where it seems like U.S. is talking about helping Israel with another attack on Iran. You have Israel continuing its bombardment of Gaza, possibly even going on into the West Bank, and like you mentioned, Kenny, blowing up Qatar under the auspices of a peace agreement being reached between them and Hamas, while they simultaneously are fighting. That have been fighting in Syria and Lebanon, obviously Gaza, like opening up so many more fronts. Israel, it seems, and what add anything else to that? Oh, and regime change, color revolution kind of things, Nepal and things happening in Indonesia. Well, I can't remember. Was there one in Thailand?
Sri Lanka, Thailand.
Thailand.
That's Southeast
Go
Asia.
ahead. You take it from there, Kenny. What else you want to add to just the mix going on around?
To just add to the Southeast Asia, basically, it's like a choke point. So it's very key to kind of containing Chinese trade, and so that is like on fire, I guess. There is a lot of unrest happening. There's also stuff happening in Africa that I'm not so familiar with, but Madagascar and other South Africa also, like things that are kind of resemble the what happened in North Africa. The what do you call that? With the youth uprising in
these Gen Z uprisings.
The Arab Spring. So
Arab Spring.
Yeah. So these are young people that are coming out and talking about corruption and lack of basic stuff and ranting against the rich people and corrupt people that rule them over. But there's people like Brian Berletic who are talking about this stuff, in terms of color revolutions, right? Like as if the U.S. has a hand in all of these things, and there's something to be discussed there. We've talked about a separate episode for that part, but that is happening. I just want to add that it's not so much military or strategic, but it's not military strategy, but it is important to note that Argentina was also bailed out by the U.S. because they're again heading to a deep financial crisis, and in the context of again Venezuela, and I think that's important to keep an eye out on. But what other things? Oh, yesterday was late last night. They announced a supposed deal in Israel between Israel and Hamas, right? But that's also questionable. But there's a lot going on.
And I would add, Michael, I hear from you. I would add this whole recent speech that the Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth gave, calling all these military people in and kind of really rebranding the Department of War. That's in the context of all this as well. Michael, do you want to add anything to like just the variety of things that are kind of happening, like events we're at least hearing about?
Yeah, I would say you mentioned Venezuela, right?
Mm-hmm.
That and particularly the Philippines, things that are closer to the U.S. somewhat, are in line with the general pattern of trying to push everyone to spend more on war, and particularly in the Philippines and in the places in Southeast Asia that were not hostile to the U.S. before. I mean, many of the countries where there's like color revolutions happening, we're not like somehow fully in, we're not like hostile to U.S. policies. So there's a kind of it all fits to me with a general clamping down on anything that's not geared towards war.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and one last thing, I guess another theme that's come up is the enemy within. We brought it up in the Charlie Kirk thing, but that was a major theme in the Trump speech of not just a hemispheric enemy that's like right next door, as opposed to the pacing problem of China, the pacing competitor of China is being a little less emphasized, but the enemy within having to be taken on, and the National Guard being mobilized in cities within the United States, and even the discussion that Trump throws out of like, a U.S. military being trained in urban warfare on its own soil. So there's a lot. And I think, Kenny, the question is what the hell? It's almost like, what the hell is the U.S. up to? And I have some thoughts about that, but well, Kenny, you should call it out here. Like, who do you want to start?
I maybe should we start maybe with the speech, that Hegseth and Trump gave to the military leadership, right?
Yeah.
Where they summon everyone, top officials from the world, right, to in to talk about reformation, essentially, of the military doctrine, right, and the policies. So maybe we can start with that.
Yeah, and I guess maybe I'll start because I don't know if I'll be saying something controversial, so then that can give you a frame for like whether you agree or disagree. Because I guess again, all these things where you look at are like Rorschach tests. They tell you as much about yourself as they do about the world. In fact, they are more a reflection of whatever I'm going to say is more a reflection of my way of thinking than it is about something that is like, oh, this is how the world works. But putting together all the things I've seen, all those things you're talking about, and I will say that overall, what it looks like is a United States in retreat, a U.S. empire in retreat. Because I do believe, while the national defense strategies that were laid out in 2018 and 2022, and really have been being in place for the last decade, those were defense strategies that said the war on terror is over, and now we have to transition from the war on terror to taking on a military that's taking on a near peer. And that's what the proxy war in Ukraine was attempting to move into, was the idea that they were going to basically erode the first near peer, not the primary near peer, but maybe the secondary near peer of Russia. And then after Russia was taken off the board and broken up through a military and economic defeat that was supposed to happen through Ukraine, then the U.S. could set its sights on China. And now the U.S. is trying to adjust itself and set its sets on China, but doing it in the context of what looks like almost a fairly big, I'm not going to say complete, a pretty big defeat for the West, the United States and NATO in the region of Ukraine, and an inability to capitalize on the collapse of Syria that they were able to do, and also an inability to use their proxy Israel to reshape the region, because I think they expected Iran to be taken down. So overall, what looks to me like the US is doing is retreating to a strategy of hemispheric control, where I think they can regain some kind of momentum, because they can't seem to regain momentum in the Middle East or in Europe, and they're losing momentum there, and they're losing a sense of being the empire that's in control. And I think that these brutal attacks that they're making on the international waters, which we didn't, that's another part of this whole thing, feel like an attempt to reassert dominance in the region that they never thought was up for grabs, the Monroe Doctrine region of South America. And I feel like this is also an attempt to challenge not China on their territory, like near them in Southeast Asia, but take on China almost in their territory. Again, I'm describing this as an empire in retreat. Doesn't want to be in retreat, but must contend with the fact that it's losing and is trying to find ground on which to win again. And secondarily, I think there are problems with what they're going to try to do, because I do think they're going to go after Venezuela. I think the enemy within talk tells me that the problems, I don't think they have any enemy from within to be worried about. It looks like it's a wrap to me. Like they've got people running to the Republican Party or Democratic Party. I'm going to actually have to say that I think the U.S. ruling class has more resources to evaluate how worried they should be about a response from within. And part of me says that they're worried about resistance at home. I don't know why. I don't see it. And I would say the one shape it has taken is the response of people challenging ICE in these communities, which I embrace. Their challenge to ICE, and I think is completely justified resistance. So they may be more worried. So that's what I'm saying. I see a picture in many ways, and I'll just say this about the speech. Like the rebranding of Department of Defense to Department of War, which is very much like, I'm going to change my placard on my door from Department of Defense to Department of War. Much of the changes that I heard being talked about by Hegseth's speech, there's some ridiculous stuff and things like that. It's very superficial. It's non-strategic. It is like it's putting the cart before the horse. Before you say why you need a war-making machine, I feel like if you were really serious about it, you would have already had your Pearl Harbor happen that says we are reorganizing ourselves to take on this opponent. It's like they did this event before the false flag that they need to happen to justify the changes. And for that reason, it feels very surface. It doesn't feel like it's going to be like it. I don't think it's going to actually lead to any kind of meaningful change in the military that's going to make it more effective for dealing at home or abroad. I don't think they know that. I just feel like they're doing these things in the wrong, like they're not able to do these things in the proper order. And so I do think they're flailing about a little bit. I do think they're serious in what they're doing, but it looks to me like somebody who's losing, and it feels closer to desperation than strategy. I'll say that. And maybe I'll put that out there as an opening bid for things.
Michael, do you want to respond to something?
I think that Andy lays out a very compelling case, and I hadn't thought. I'm always impressed by how far-reaching Andy's sort of predictions and framings are that the U.S. is retreating to a regional strategy. I think that does seem to connect a lot of dots. And, I'm not sure. I do know for a fact, though, that everything politicians do is actually mainly for show. So, the speech to the generals to me is not some major strategic, doesn't actually, has much more to do with the internal audience than it has to do with anything else, meaning the US audience. But in terms of the US maintaining control in its own backyard, I do see that as consistent with, the fact that things are not going well for them. However, I do think that there are things are not going well for them in Ukraine, and they're not going as well as I think. I agree that it's not going as well as they had hoped in the Middle East, but I do think that there is some amount of strategy involved here. The strategy is destabilization, and one of the things that I looked at carefully, spent a little more time looking at, was the unrest in Nepal. And what's happening in Nepal is very interesting to me. It reminded me somewhat of, like, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where you have you have real social forces that are set into motion. So you can't just completely manufacture all the anger of the youth, but you have essentially an economy where there's massive unemployment. The youth are facing a lot of uncertainty, and it seems like the government tried to crack down on tech companies internally, and that did lead to real anger amongst young people, which of course was organized and led by forces that had been cultivated by the US, right? So there's the instability that we know is inherent structurally in capitalism becomes a predictable source of power for the empire, right? So I don't think it's a matter of that like the U.S. is in control of all these things, but they were positioned to use them to their advantage, and that's what it means that they're the world superpower. What's unclear to me is what are the internal forces that are now taking over in Nepal, for example, because there's now an interim prime minister who was tied to US NED, but it doesn't seem like there's any real fundamental shift within Nepal internally. And it's a similar question to me in the Philippines. It's not like, it is what I see as, as consistent with your model there, Andy, and this is also kind of what Brian Berletic says, is that the unrest in the Philippines will be used to root out any opposition essentially to U.S. interests that may have existed. And I don't even know what that looked like in the Philippines. Seems like Philippines for a long time was essentially a corrupt client state of the U.S. So so what does it mean that there's a color revolution kind of happening in the Philippines? It's unclear to me, but it does seem like it could be explained by the U.S. trying to reassert control. And it can also be consistent with that there's real anger and at the instability. The question, though, is what organizational forces are there to take it in a new direction? And this is where I feel like, having read Marx's analysis of the revolutions, the bourgeois revolutions, is really useful. But I feel like there's a lot of work to do to understand how that kind of dynamic is playing out now in all these different places. I guess long story short is like there's a good structural reason why people are upset and protesting. Like there's a natural reason why people would be revolting, calling out the excesses of their governments and the corruption. It's like, yes, that's fundamentally what this economic system is built on, is corruption and excesses of people at the top. But then you go and read like these youth leaders' speeches, and it's just more nationalism. It's just sort of empty nationalism of like, we have to fight for our fatherland, and our forefathers died to give us this great country. And it's like there's nothing new here, right? So who was able to capitalize on it? So I do think, in a way, there is a strategy of sowing instability, and then from that, and it may be a desperate strategy, but I do think that is, in a sense, a strategy, is controlling, trying to have a hand in what happens when things are completely destabilized.
I just want to say that, as much as there is a hand of the U.S. right in this unleashing of energy, right, of social energy, I think it also reflects on us, right? And just to kind of reinforce that point that you made, Libson, that the yes, there is the opposite. At least I'm very negative on the amount of resistance that we have here. Like, we've been screwed, since COVID. Like, I insist on, paying 25% more, right, on things. That alone, right? In other countries, that would unleash a bunch of social energy. And yeah, it might not be organized. It might not be, have an organized political component to it. But I think it still shows that there is some awareness and resistance, in like fuck you type of thing, like in Guatemala has happened. And yes, there's always American hands, but you can't deny the social energy. Where here we're just willing to accept whatever the hell they give us, and like walk to the ballot box. I actually read NPR, describing what happened in Nepal. How people were burning like institutional offices and this and that. And I've seen this happen in Latin America. Is very common, actually. and I think, like, yes, the people in power should be afraid, like that this energy can become something that will, you know, overthrow them in some way. And so that to me is still a positive, side to see in other countries, not here. Um, and on another point, I wanted to talk about your argument on the retreat, Libson, because I have questions. Like, just like Michael, I think you do make a compelling argument as to, the things that I struggle with is that, the U.S. has for decades at this point known that they don't have the capacity, right, to engage in an industrial type of war. I don't see an urgency at all, to kind of catch up, if you will, to the industrial power of China and Russia. And obviously, like, I think we might all agree, right, like that there's always the nuclear component to it, right? Like, there's always, just flip the board game and it's over, or like, let's see who survives, the brutality. So if you are going to retreat, it doesn't mean, right, like that it's a capitulation, that the US, all right, we're going to accept the polar order, and that's it. So since they've known that, because I don't think the people who rule the US are stupid, they've had a strategy, it might not work, that is, the opponent always has a say in the game. And so so they can still screw up China. I read this article by KJ No, and I'll put it, maybe we can link it up here, where he talks about the American strategy in the South Pacific. And the US doesn't have to have a lot of presence necessarily, their direct presence, direct engagement, but they can absolutely complicate trade for China through that channel, right, to the Southeast Asian choke point, where KJ Noah, he argues that 70% of China's trade goes through that area. So it's a massive, strategic arena. And so again, like the U.S., I think they know that they cannot engage in conventional warfare with anybody, but they do have the capacity to disrupt. And so I don't know. So like, is that part of the plan, or was that a mistake? Same guy Cajun. No, he argues that because of like essentially the development of capitalism. Uh, uh, Vigi also argues that, right, like we've become a more financialized system, right, in the West, rather than the actual industrial production of the system. And so they've known ahead of time this, they committed to this. And so what I want to understand is, like, was that a mistake? Was that something that they planned, to handle this way? Like, you know what I mean? Is this actually their actual plan? Because they could never engage directly.
Well, first off, the part that Michael is raising of these color revolutions, that I think all of us agree that underneath these countries are class antagonisms, that I do believe that those are there. And there's a genuine sentiment of like, F you to your leaders in all those countries. I think the timing of them is entirely unnatural and is entirely a product of U.S. Construction, and is a hand they're playing, and that is not a retreat. Actually, that is a new. It's opening a new wing upon which to go. And I forgot to mention that, because I think that part is to say, well, if you will, then maybe they're retreating on one sector, but they're advancing in another. And the thing you're saying, Kenny, about, I do believe that the U.S. knows they can't take their naval fleet and put them all near Japan and think that they're going to blockade China. They know that their entire fleet will be sunk within a week. Like that's the kind of talk it's happened. And I do know that the way they talk about engaging China is away from China, but isolating them far. Okay, maybe you can trade with Indonesia, but there are going to be other choke points that we can stop you in, and that will be our way of making war with you. And I think what they're doing, and in that regard, in some ways, what they're doing with these Venezuelan boats is kind of a little example of the way the U.S. plans to proceed with with Russia and China away from their shores. Like, we'll blow your shit up, because here's the advantage the U.S. does have over everyone. They are the global hegemon. And I was talking to my brother about this morning. I'll say this, that the Ukraine war, the way that Russia is winning the Ukraine war is by extending the front, making the front larger, and making it so broad that the Ukrainian forces can't defend everything. So they try to punch holes in areas that they can, and if they can't, they don't go too hard. They just try to force them to move their troops around along an extended front. And this is the way the U.S. is going to. Like, people think that the U.S. being a global empire and having all these bases all over the place is a weakness. This is where we see it's not. This is where we see that what the U.S. can do to China and Russia is extend them across the globe. It's like, we can fight you. We are a global empire, and we can fight a war against you on all across the front of the globe that you are not in a position to do, because you are a regional power. We are a global power, and we are going to use our resources that we have across the globe, whether they be media and CIA and USAID and things like that, or whether we have a global Navy and a global Air Force and aircraft carriers. We have, like, what are those different comms, CENTCOM and SOUTHCOM and blah, 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 AFRICOM, and we have a global naval and aviation empire that can take you on anywhere we want. And you cannot do the same with us. So you can win in one place, but we can win in 3 other places force you to respond to that and create an opening in the place that you were strong before, which is like that's how Russia's taking out Prokhof. It's a city, Prokofsk, I think it's called, or whatever. It's like it's the next big city that Russia's trying to take. They're challenging other regions and forcing and stretching their Ukrainian forces and NATO forces to fight there. So, but I will say that underneath this, the reason why I still believe that the general trajectory is retreat is, and that this is a new strategy that they're devising in relationship to, they're trying to leverage their power as an empire to try to reclaim something, because I do believe the Ukraine war was a giant surprise to them. I believed they thought by this point that they would, that the Russian regime would be collapsing under the military defeat that they were facing, or even the military quagmire they were in, but in the context of an economic collapse that they would then be able to go in the way that they did in the Soviet Union, and go in and like break up the resources and then access the resources and then use the control of those resources and strengthen Europe even, and then go after China. So far from having what they expected to be a victory, they are experiencing a defeat in that region currently. And that's why I think they're having to regroup. So I'll say that.
I guess I want to touch on the regional thing, because I've been saying this about Venezuela, that yes, Venezuela's oil is not easy to access, right? Like it's not easy to refine, right? Like it requires a lot of resources. But to me, if the U.S. is going to secure its regional, hold, I see it as yes, in a way, a retreat, right? But it's to kind of get a footing to go ahead, because I still think that this ends in a intensification, right, of the fight, because China and Russia, yes, they don't have global ambitions in the same way that the U.S. to have the in even if they're playing defense in their own area, they're gonna have to break through blockades. They're gonna have to break to through the traps that are laid by the U.S. and maybe and so just going back to Latin America, I do think that, for example, El Salvador's model of a government it's like a neo-dictator type of thing, will be more implemented in different countries in the Americas, to again get a better grip on the resources that are available here. Lithium in Bolivia, oil in Venezuela, and other things. So in that way is how Latin America comes into this global fight that is going to happen. And so maybe my question is, and again I have a question. Can you maybe talk about what is China doing? Why China gets entangled into the fight? Because right now, right, they don't have the headlines like Russia does, like Israel does, at least in our hemisphere. So what is China doing about this, and what is kind of their plan? I know you've talked about that book that you read, the Long Game book. So maybe you can say something to that, or you, Michael.
Can I just make one response, Michael, and then maybe you can go?
Go ahead.
Well, first off, you said China and Russia don't have global ambitions. I don't know if you believe that, but I do believe they have global ambitions. They don't have the resources to act on those ambitions as easily as the United States does. So I do believe Russia and China have global ambitions. They want to be hegemons, just like the United States is currently the hegemon. What I think will be different is 15 years ago or 20 years ago, if the US went into Venezuela and did what it's doing, China's going to stay out of it. Russia's going to stay out of it. They're not going to stay out of it in my opinion, they're not going to stay out of it this time. They're going to attempt, China for sure, in my opinion, we'll see. But this will also, in my opinion, prove that Brian Berletic is wrong in believing that there's multipolar world peace, that China this time is going to make Venezuela a dirty war for the United States. They're going to try to make Venezuela the next Vietnam for the United States by either arming or supporting rebels in Venezuela, or by supporting people who want to go into Venezuela and liberate Venezuela. If the United States should do what I think they're going to try to do, which is what you're saying, Kenny, yes, I believe they're going to try to do, and get a hold of resources and use their control of those resources to project their power even more, and to even challenge BRICS. I think taking on South America allows them to begin to challenge the B part of BRICS, Brazil. And like you mentioned, there's even meddling in South Africa. I think they're going to start to try to destabilize the forces that try to make up BRICS. And so the China is not going to, I don't think they're going to stand by that. I think they're going to do the kinds of things that we saw the United States do in Afghanistan when Russia went in. And that's going to be a different role for them. And maybe people will say, oh, they're just supplying the independence movement like that. No, in my opinion, this is going to be empire versus empire fighting to see who can control the globe and using their various proxies to do so. But I do believe it's going to be different this time. China's going to make U.S. pay a military price for any aggression that it puts in that region. That's my belief.
I just want to call out that Andy has now just made a very bold prediction. And I can't wait to come back to that prediction later and see how it panned out. My questions about that prediction are China's strategy and what we know about China's strategy. I feel that, or at least if you listen to the very pro-China left, the Chinese strategy is to let the West fall. And this is this connects to another point I wanted to make. If China really just lets the West show itself as being desperate and brutal, then it's going to be able to grow its influence in those U.S. competitors. And one of the problems that we've been seeing with the U.S.'s strategy is it does seem to be pushing its enemies together, right? So like this stuff in Venezuela does look like it's going to push them towards, to be closer with China. I don't know though how, so I'll be interested to see, and I want to know also if you have evidence that China is currently funding or sending arms to Venezuela. I don't know anything about that. I would like to know. But I wanted to make another point about the U.S.'s flailing, which relates to the enemy within. I think that they're not necessarily worried about an organized enemy from within, but they do have to actively co-opt the discontent that exists. So like, if in the discussion of the Charlie Kirk thing, it drew my attention to the growing rejection of support for Israel on the right, and just globally, what a disaster! The genocide and the most recent phase of the genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. It's been a disaster for Israel internationally, right? I mean, we have. If you follow what's happening on the flotilla, there are, massive protests all over the world. General strikes in not here, but there's a problem for them if Israel completely loses legitimacy, like a real problem. And so I think that the enemy within part is that they have to make sure that nothing forms, right? They have to make sure that those forces don't congeal and don't get organized. And there's explicit literature about that in the counterinsurgency literature. Like they do think ahead. and they do see a problem of people, just watching what's happening in the world and going like, gosh, this is so messed up. How can we trust or believe what the U.S. says? And so to me, it's not, to me, the U.S. ruling class has to stay ahead of that, and they feel that they have to. But right now, it's mainly a cooptative form. Like now, they've got Candace Owens kind of leading a more mainstream right-wing anti-Israel vein, but framing it around that Israel is just oppressing the U.S. and it's sort of on the basis of U.S. must prioritize itself. It's U.S. nationalism against sort of supporting this foreign country, and I feel like things are primed very well for that co-optation because of the structure and the complete destruction of the left. And this is a point. So that destruction of the left in the United States means that we have almost entirely official channels for making change. We have entirely, and it's almost all channeled through like NGOs and nonprofits. And the reading that I've been doing recently is about, the basically the gains that were made after the civil rights movement were essentially channeled into these identitarian or sort of poverty management systems, and that those same things were actually developed in other countries, meaning like internationally, stuff like the National Endowment for Democracy looked very much like US nonprofit narratives. And so what I'm coming back around to with talking about all this is that the US empire is not just its military bases, it is the development of a co-optative leadership throughout the world that is embedded in these places.
Yep.
And it's and any unrest can then become leadership within that unrest, because they prevent other leadership from getting organized, and they have ideologically positioned themselves to have answers to that unrest. But in the end, they don't solve the problem. The youth in Nepal, I think, will be very disappointed, when they get the reforms that they're asking for. So I don't know. That's just my observation.
I want to second that comment. That's where we're supposed to come in, right? Like the people who have a different explanation of what's happening, right? Like an alternative to Candace Owens radicalism, right? Like she's now talking about, right, no, forget about the right and the left, but make America great again, right? Like, and even if in her questioning of the Charlie Kirk stuff, like she fails to talk about capitalism, the system that we're saying that it's a systemic thing, right? Like that regardless of who goes, is who's elected, is a system that is a totalitarian system. That's what I refer it to. It's in every aspect of our lives. It's driven by the profit motive. It enhances or magnifies the worst parts of humanity. Like greed and competition and destruction, and so I agree. Like that is why I'm so completely demoralized when I see this, stuff happening, not just there, but here, really locally, because and that is my critique of, when I was in San Francisco, because as little as I knew about Marxism, and I'm still learning, about, I know that fundamental, very basic argument, like to question the profit motive. And, it's not about some corrupt officials, like if we just had some better, more principled people in place, then this is going to work. No, that's not how it works, and that's why I have frustrations with also the libertarian angle, right? Like that they take that position, right? That it's corrupt leadership. It's not a systemic thing, and then so we end up with these notions that there is this group of people, which there are, but that they're in cahoots with each other to rule over the world, and so they don't have the same urgency, right? That we might have to say, like, look, like these motherfuckers are going to drive us to the cliff. It's a systemic thing, regardless of who's in place, and so we have to take control. Like, forget about trying to reform these institutions. We have to make our own, and so I mean that's, I feel like, our message, right? Like that's what we talk. Bring it back to capitalism. That's what we have to talk about, the big things in a way, right? Like that people understand that is, because yes, there is rabbit holes, and that's where I have an issue with certain approaches, that we have to understand the big thing, and it has to be translated to the masses, uh, and then people will take their own journeys, but we have to keep at it with this message, that it's a system, it's an anarchic competition, right? Where everyone's playing to win, and it's a zero sum game. It's not, there's no sharing in this system, and so, like, that's why all the roads that we're discussing here, right? Like, whether the U.S. retreating or advancing, it still ends in a massive bellic, clash of, because you're right, Lipson. Like, I think I don't mean that Russia and China don't have global aspirations. They're trying to go about it differently, because you're right, they don't have the capacity. That's what I mean. Like, they don't have the global reach. That's, I guess, they don't. But they're still playing to win, and if you're not playing to win, you're getting eaten. That goes to any part. If you're a small business and you're not trying to grow, you're gonna fucking get crushed. That's why this system, right, like, has the inertia to go into monopoly, regardless of which angle you talk about. Like, it's monopoly or nothing.
I think that to take up this question of, and we're using Candace Owens as a kind of a placeholder.
Oh,
There's lots
right.
of people who speak to this, and people can sit there and say, "Oh, is that person a limited hangout, or or whatever?"
Tucker Carlson.
Right, right,
Tucker Carlson.
right. But
Name even.
do I agree with that notion of don't let left and right be divided? I do agree with that. With seeing that they're trying to use these political divisions, but when Michael, you identify that weak point, you can see within that line when people like Candace or Tucker say Israel is controlling the United States. In that statement is them letting off the hook the main author of the violence.
Yep.
And that's important, because that main author will later be saying we have to go after China, and you're going to find that Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, when U.S. says we have to go after China, are not going to be as convincing, are suddenly going to be on a different foot, and maybe even justify the U.S. doing some of the things it does, and that's a weakness in our position. Like, the sort of a I'll be a little more interested in hearing. I mean, I do listen to Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson because I want to know what they're saying, kind of thing. But it'll be more interesting to me when some of these figures take an open border position. That would be a consequence of seeing that we are being played in a left-right divide, or would actually say no. Like Brian Berletic is clear. Brian Berletic is clear that the U.S. controls Israel, and for that reason, I think he's going to be more successful at not being tripped into various imperial tricks. His biggest weakness, I believe, is that he believes that China and Russia represent an alternative, some kind of peaceful alternative to that, and also does not believe revolution's possible because it's just not going to happen. So his only alternative is to look to other big powers to bring peace to the globe. And that I don't think that's. I think that's a unicorn. It's a mythology. It's not going to happen. The thing I would say this discussion has made me realize is, or not realize, come to change in my view, is what between the two things that Kenny, you and Michael are bringing up, the U.S. is playing a new hand that is a better hand for them. It's not one that they necessarily talked about in their defense strategy documents, nor would they, because this is the underworld that they occupy as a global empire. I wonder to what extent it will find expression in a strategy either in white papers or RAND documents or CSIS or things like that. But yes, I will say that there's a kind of retreat the U.S. is doing, but now I do see, but they've opened up a new front. They're opening up a new front in the war. And that's not the same thing as a retreat. It's clear to me that they have a definite better global hand than I keep forgetting. It's not just military, it's not just economy. It's like you said, it's like that nonprofit organization across the globe is pretty significant, so that when they can create a spark to antagonize those class divisions within an enemy country, then they can grab hold of it and get control of it, so that it no longer represents anything independent, which is truly what's most important about any of these revolutionary kernels, is they maintain their independence. And if they don't, then it's a different ballgame. Then you're talking about, like, the Ukrainians have the right to defend themselves against Russian invasion, but if they call in NATO and Europe and the United States, then there's nothing independent in them. It's just part of imperialist war. Then you're just asking to be which side of the imperialists, and that there are no sides for the working class in that imperial conflict except our own, which is to end imperial war and create civil war at home to take down your own government. That is the calling that I believe is the task of working classes in their respective areas. So this is what this conversation has made me realize, is that the U.S. has a better hand to play. And I think what you're saying, Michael, is the enemy within is more a little bit more long-term than necessarily seeing a short-term threat. I think that's what you're saying, and I'm not sure, but I could buy that. And maybe I'm mischaracterizing what you're saying.
I mean, there's a lot I don't know, but that is to me, it makes sense. But I also wanted to say that I think they look at things in terms of markets. They just are looking at the world and saying, like, oh, okay, we got a lot more. The anti-Israel market has expanded. And so we need to capitalize on that. Like there's a much more just like basic cynical logic that also leads to this kind of counterinsurgency. It's just good business for Candace Owens to start being, it's just, there's a wing of, and I keep talking about Candace Owens, but Tucker Carlson is even a bigger example. But that's also the way that they don't have to think. It doesn't necessarily have to be long-term thinking. They know right now, in the present moment, driving the culture war is lucrative. Not even just politically useful, but like literally lucrative. So there's kind of like I can't unsee this kind of overlap between, essentially the market for ideas and the generating hate and anger and clicks with essentially commodifying people's emotions and therefore owning them. There's like it feels like a real fundamental problem, like a deeper thing than even a conscious strategy, and however, there is also conscious strategy, seem to go together, I'm not sure how useful that is. The more I feel like I understand the structure of it, or I see the way the structure reinforces the power, the less I feel like anything's really going to happen in terms of a rebellion. But I do see largely we are captured. The resistance is completely within acceptable bounds, especially internally. And there are multiple mechanisms operating that do that. So,
yeah. And who was it that was saying that these Nepal groups are just talking about the same old national stuff? That kind of does tell you that there's nothing new here. And that's the part that says, yeah, it's going to be easy to politically control and direct, and it's no real threat to the existing order. I don't know who said that's true.
That was me, and I just, it was like I was scrolling, and someone posted a speech by one of the youth leaders in Nepal, and I watched it, and it was like, how it was always the workers' world people at the demonstrations. They would always talk like this, and we're going to take over, and we're going to confront the ruling class. It was like that kind of thing. But he was basically talking about we have to, do it for the nation.
Yeah,
we must, because our forefathers died to give us this nation. We must fight for it. Nothing new. So if you're positioned to always become the leadership, then and this is exactly what happened in Syria. I see, although it's not as under the thumb of the U.S. as I think we thought, but like instability. If you are positioned to play a leadership role in it, instability becomes power for you. And this is kind of goes back to this basic structure. Like every single conflict internationally will be sort of reduced to a contest between imperialist nations, and we see that playing out.
And I think that that's exactly where Trump fits in, right? That's his brand, that's his strategy. Like he's unpredictable. He'll change his mind. He'll say dumb shit. Like he'll talk about himself. Uh, because it doesn't matter. We'll do what we'll do. And like so, whatever our leader says don't really matter. Like I put little weight on that as much as like what it's actually happening and done. And so that's why I wanted to have this conversation as to why are they striking boats in Venezuela. And I think I have a better reading now on or what they say is Venezuelan boats, right? Like because it's also hard to confirm some of these narratives, right? Like we still have to question these things. And I want to make a bold prediction, actually. I don't know. Even though I just said that Trump makes sense for this, I think that Tucker Carlson will be president one day. He's gonna be the philosopher king because this motherfucker. I don't trust his ass. Like he is very charming. He's very charming. I listen to his conversations. He talks to power and shit like that, right? Like, but he also was in the Charlie Kirk event, right? He's also part of that power, and he was the more measured, moderate, out of everyone there. And he's still close to the power, even though he's supposedly talking to it against it, right? He's still right there. And I just feel like when a more measured philosopher king is needed, he's gonna be there.
very possible. Just one thing I wanted to throw in there that could, like, I agree with you, Michael, when you said that that's a bit of a bold prediction to say that China's going to play a new role. But it was articles like this that I read when I was looking into this. I'll just show you this title. This was in 2024. You know, China stands by Maduro in Venezuela to safeguard its investments. This is a year ago. And talking about how the deep investments China had made in the Venezuelan government and in Venezuela, not just for the access to oil, but infrastructure and things like that. I think all of those things, when the U.S. goes into Venezuela and takes hold again, they know who they're displacing. They're not displacing Maduro. They're trying to displace China. I think this time, China's not. I believe that China's prepared to do to United States what the U.S. did to Russia and Afghanistan, and that's. I think the mask is off for everyone. The long run book that I read that Kenny's referring to really shows for a 40-year project of various onions being peeled as China reveals itself more and more to be not an ally but an opponent of the United States. And I think that is now in full bloom. I don't think China any longer tries to even pretend. Um, and so when Putin goes to a Sochi and says, "You think we're a paper tiger?" Well, it looks like us as a paper tiger can't be defeated by you. So who's the paper tiger? And then when he's saying you, he's saying NATO. He keeps the United States out of it. So there's no way Russia's going to talk that way unless Russia and China and India are now talking in a way that says we have gone beyond the point of no return. They know the game is on. We know the game is on, and now it's a matter of who wins. So I don't think there's going to be any hiding any longer of China's attempts to destabilize U.S. in the same way that they've been doing that around the globe. So, but I think it'll be interesting to see. And if when reports come out that China is doing something weird in Venezuela, we cannot immediately say that's the case. But I think it'll be interesting.
I didn't call that a bold prediction because I, thought it was the wrong prediction.
Yeah, no. But it was.
I like to earmark those bold predictions.
Yeah, I
agree. We have two on this episode. Yeah, we have Tucker Carlson's going to be president, and China's going to help turn Venezuela into the next Vietnam for the United States. My question about that though is, what if China is content with being left alone in its region? Meaning, like, what if the multipolar as essentially an integration of competing capitals into different spheres of influence? Obviously, I don't think the U.S. is going to peacefully allow that to happen. But I guess my question is, I don't know that that China wants to destabilize the United States in more than it would allow them to just do business in larger parts of the world. I one of the main things that helps me not trust the Chinese communists is basically that they don't call for an overthrow of international capitalism. Right? They're not saying they're not saying global capitalism and institute. They're not overtly revolutionary in that sense, but they do seem very careful in terms of not picking fights they know they can't win. So I guess that's the question I have is it necessarily does China even have to necessarily directly intervene in order to protect its interests?
My answer is yes, because of the state of global capitalism now, and because the world has moved too far down the road into world war, and I do believe that those scenes of U.S. blowing up ships in international waters are not lost on the Chinese, who know that their one weakness is what Kenny was talking about, or those choke points. And so, I mean, if they don't do that, I personally think they are being foolish as they're not really challenging for the crown. If you're gonna take on the king, you got to be prepared to kill the king. That's how this system works. So that's my belief. But maybe there could be a if you will, so-called nicer, more long-term way and still win. Maybe, because I don't know, because they can game these things out. My sense is things are going to get more violent, and that means all actors are going to have to be more violent.
I would also say, yeah, the system is in crisis. It comes down to controlling literal physical stuff, right? Like, and like a lot of the governments are putting, like they're increasing the reserves of gold, right? Like it almost reminds me of the mercantilist system, like just like having gold, physical gold in your, and the way I see, again, if China is not expanding, they're going to shrink. They're going to be, and they have the opium wars, right? To kind of like remember that they were picked apart by the other imperial powers, and so if they don't know their history, like if that alone doesn't motivate them to keep pushing, I think that they're making a mistake. And again, just simply, if they're not expanding, they're going to be shrinking. But I also want to say that China. We've talked about the global reach of the U.S. China has itself, unleashed a bunch of global influence, right? Like they built ports in Peru, they built stuff in Latin America and Africa. So they have stuff out there, right? And they're going to have to be prepared to defend the stuff from being just taken. And so that's why I don't see, I see the collision course continuing, right? Because of all these factors that, and so as much as we see the U.S. Playing its cards right now, I think we'll see more conflict in other areas that involves those two because of the investments that they've made.
And you probably saw that the industrial the shipbuilding capacity of China is like 300-fold what the United States is. Like that one congressperson complaining that like we can fit all our shipbuilding capacity into the size of one of the shipbuilding operations that China had. I think they actually currently have in terms of per ship, larger Navy than the United States. They don't have a larger reach. But all these things are in motion. So we'll see. Any last comments?
What's your bold prediction, Michael?
Yes, what's your bold prediction exactly?
My bold prediction is the working class is going to keep getting the shit beat out of it, and there's not going to be fight back.
That's the safest bet you could ever lay.
No, I mean, literally, like, I spent my time just trying to get people to talk about these ideas, and it keeps leading me to like, and by the way, whoever has this kind of infrastructure then can be the leadership of a revolutionary moment, right? And now it's like, and we're so far from having anything built even close to that. And looking at the color revolution in Nepal, and then rereading stuff from Marx, I'm like, we are fucked. The high point really was the Russian Revolution internationally, where you had a semblance of an explicitly revolutionary anti-capitalist movement that had infrastructure and some semblance of internal democracy, and like we don't even have a culture of like deliberation.
Yeah.
And it's been consciously like deliberation and then group decision and then like reflection on the decision. Like that's part of what the nonprofit apparatus does. Is it prevents that from developing.
Yeah.
So like the learning, the working class becoming fit to rule, like where is that even? Where can that happen? Right? It's not happening within the unions, right? It's not. So I don't know.
Yeah. No.
But I know that it's very useful to talk to you and think about these things. So I don't feel so isolated, and I do feel like things make sense. But the balance of forces is not looking good.
Yeah.
For us.
Yeah. But I do believe at the end of the day, probably the conversations, while we will have to be able to keep our eye on the ball of what our enemies or opponents are doing, the people our oppressors, I guess, are doing. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest difficulties is our class and our class allies aren't even having the conversation about what we need to do for ourselves. And,
right.
There's so much that has to, I'm not even going to call it a thing of time, but there's so much that has to happen that's not happening. for the ball to start moving in a different direction. We'll see. Because I think, honestly, if that kind of movement was happening here, that's all we would be talking about on what's left from week to week to week. I mean, I can't see any other conversation. It would go beyond Ukraine and Venezuela. I mean, it would influence some of the debates about that might be happening in the movement. But the reason that the reason we are talking about these things that are in some ways far away while they were late is because there's so little to talk about what we ourselves are doing. And that is just an unfortunate reality that I think we just have to keep reminding ourselves that we're not having the conversation we really want to be having.
It just what we're doing is trying to figure out how we're getting tumbled.
Yeah,
Right. That's
the tumbleweed, trying to make sense of the direction it's being blown.
Right.
Oh boy, oh boy.
I mean, more importantly, though, there is a tradition, a connection to a tradition that I feel is very important to keep alive, and that's why these conversations are really important. And you said something so exactly right, Andy, that like we're not even having the conversation within our class about what to do about ourselves. I am having a terrible time just getting any one of the faculty members to see that actually not somehow, it's not somehow selfish for us to do some amount of disobedience related to our own contract negotiations, right? Like if you can't even do a little thing to stick up for yourself, they use this cover like, oh, we're so much better off than X, Y, or Z person. I'm like, but you're not doing anyone any good if you can't even stick up for yourself.
Yeah.
You're gonna go up against the boss, like for undocumented students, when you can't even skip a freaking optional. You can't even skip an optional training day.
Yeah, that's true.
You're so fucked because they see everything as like this transactional. That's a whole nother episode.
Yeah.
But so, however, there are young people who are pissed off who have been good. It feels good to talk to people who at least want to go through this history and have not written it off entirely. Whether that turns into anything, I don't have high hopes. However, the class anger is real and it emerges from people's experiences. It's just when you have no infrastructure of leadership that connects our actual, research, like what are the research-based effective practices for winning any kind of little reform? It doesn't look like it does not look like what's happening now. It looks like basic solidarity of like, no, you skip, you don't go to work, you don't cross the picket line. You have to actually exact some kind of consequences on powerful people. You can't just sway them, right? So I that's the kind of thing I'm trying to at least keep alive in my workplace. It was like, hey, there's this thing we call research-based effective practices. What is that for class struggle? Mm-hmm. It's like it's basic class consciousness. You would not have even, so like the history of the civil rights movement is like, the gains really are rooted in basic class consciousness. Like that's a large portion of why the civil rights movement was effective. And there was class unity that does not exist. There was cross-class unity that doesn't exist anymore. So like, to continue to think that there's going to be somehow, this agreement amongst all oppressed people is just, it's so, now I'm like, that's counterinsurgency. You are actually helping the bosses, and you think somehow you're sticking up for oppressed people because your anti-racism is actually just anti-solidarity. It's anti-class politics. It's keeping us in our fucking chains.
Another conversation.
Sorry. You can cut all that. It's not relevant.
We'll see.
So there you
Well, Kenny, I'm glad you brought this up.
Yeah, me too.
This might be the last time we see you for a little while, hey?
We'll see. I'll
All
let you know.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. And hopefully Eduardo will be here next week. Michael, do you need to sign off right now? Because you might be busy.
I need to go. Thank you so much, guys.
All
Thanks
right,
for having me.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
So that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes wherever you found this episode or on our blog, what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find the link to our blog in the episode notes. If you want to reach out to us about ideas for future episodes, feel free to use that link to contact us at What's Left directly. I think having talked to one of our listeners recently, there might be a discussion about pacifism, revolutionary pacifism in our future. We'll see. I remind folks, if you like anything you have heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our 7 platforms on Spotify, iTunes, BitChute, Odyssey, Rumble, YouTube, or Telegram. So that's it this week. Kenny, I hope we do see you soon. Good luck going back to the grind. And it's been great to be able to have you back on our show for the time you've been here.
Thank you. I enjoy being here.
Yeah. And so for me, for Kenny, for Michael, see you all folks next week.